Hey, and welcome to the Neurodivergent Musician podcast, where I explore the world of neurodiversity and musicianship. I'm your host, John Hart, and today I'll be joined by Ashleigh Magner, who is a specialist occupational therapist, and today we'll be chatting about sensory processing and sensory profiling. So without further ado, let's get into that conversation. Hey, Ashleigh, how you doing?
Hey, John. Good to see you.
Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. So we've known each other a while, but instead of me kind of, trying to introduce yourself and me doing it wrong or anything as well, could you introduce yourself for us?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Ashleigh Magner, and I'm an occupational therapist. I grew up in South Africa and I've been living in the UK for about 7 or 8 years now. I stumbled into the field of learning differences and learning disabilities well over a decade ago, purely by accident, really, just because a really nice job came up in my local area. And it was a real blessing in disguise. I've been in the field ever since. It's something that I'm super passionate about. And I just love helping people to realize themselves, accept themselves, love themselves, and live their most independent, meaningful lives.
Amazing. And how have you connected with neurodivergence on the way?
Oh, plenty.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Many, many over the years. Yes. Pre-diagnosis, diagnosed, misdiagnosed, growing in awareness, no clue at all. Yes, all
all,
sorts.
all the above.
Yeah.
And so one thing that we're going to talk today about, and again, it might kind of go off into different subjects, which tends to happen with these conversations, is the sensory profiling and seeing it as a possible starting point, or you know, instead of delving into the sort of labels route and things, which obviously is really important. You can go into it, but how have you viewed that side, and how have you got into that within your profession?
Oh, yes, I should have said about my special interest within the field of occupational therapy. Um, a lot of occupational therapists are familiar with sensory integration, and I think I work across the lifespan. So my youngest client is 3, and my oldest client is in their 40s. But particularly circulating in the pediatric field, sensory integration is something that you will come across pretty quickly. So I am a qualified sensory integration practitioner, and I just love learning about this stuff. I think that it just makes so much sense that our senses are our primary experience of the world. While we are awake, we are processing information all the time through our senses. And that's the lens with which we view the world, life. That's how we make sense of what's going on around us, how we need to do what we need to do every day. And working with a lot of, well, how prevalent is sensory processing differences? I think in the field of neurodiversity, I mean, thinking about research and quoting journal articles, etc., the quality of the research differs depending on, well, many variables and factors, but all the research out there is suggesting that there's a really high prevalence of sensory processing differences in the neurodivergent population. And even in the neurotypical population, there's varying evidence which states that it can be, between 5 and 16% of the population experience sensory processing differences. So that's a significant amount of people that are experiencing the world in a very unique and different way. And it really, really helps to have an awareness around what is your experience of the world.
So when, especially with sensory, and I think obviously like it's almost like what you just said, we're kind of navigating the world, but there's kind of an external awareness all the time. That's pretty much how I grew up. It was just like I never had any internal awareness, really. I was just, obviously there's things going on, but you're like, no, it's the external that's affecting my internal world. That's it. That's how I lived with it. And it's probably how a lot of people, until they become aware of certain things. Like, look, you've got to look inwards, and it can obviously um, help your external world a massive amount since going through. We'll go into it, but since diagnoses and also the sensory profiling, knowing about the awareness, education, trying to put management, actioning, it's a long sort of process with it. But I've now known, instead of it's outside in, I'm like, hang on a minute, no, it's inside out. I've got to really focus on myself first, fill up myself a cup, do all the healing, whatever it is, which obviously is a long time. But I definitely feel, since we've done the sensory profiling, and assessments and things, I even had a look again at it today, and just how valuable it is. I just wondered, actually, if we could go into the process of the sensory profiling, and how you start and how you kind of get access to it.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing would be to find probably an occupational therapist with a bit of an interest in sensory processing or sensory integration, or you can also find some physiotherapists or speech and language therapists, but someone with a bit of an understanding in sensory processing and sensory integration. And there's different uh, intensities of assessments that you can undergo. So there's from a one-page screening form, which will give you a little bit of a basic awareness or overview of your sensory profile, to what we did, which was a far more in-depth sensory assessment, which took us about 3 hours to complete. And we looked at all of your senses, and individually, as well as how they integrate and work together. So yeah, there's varying degrees of how in depth that assessment can be. That would be the first place to start, is find someone that can support you with doing that assessment and then making sense of that. So then what you do is you would then have a look at your different senses. So I'm sure most of the listeners are familiar with the 5 typical senses. So your sense of hearing, your sense of sight, your sense of touch, your sense of smell, your sense of taste. But as occupational therapists, we think about 8 senses, actually. So those 5, as well as your vestibular sense, which, to put it quite simply, is your sense of movement and posture. And then your proprioceptive sense, which is you get that information through your muscles and your joints, and that's your understanding of where your body is in space. And then your 8th sense is your interoceptive sense, which is your sense of what's going on inside of your body. And that helps you to feel and sense homeostatic emotions like thirst and hunger and fatigue, pain, as well as emotions like anger and sadness and anxiety and overwhelm. So we'd have a look at all of those 8 senses and how they work individually, as well as how they work together, because no experience in life is just one sensory experience, just touch alone or just vision alone. Every experience in daily life is a combination of a lot of our senses working together and helping each other out. So would it be helpful for me to maybe explain a little bit about how those sensory processing differences can present in daily
Definitely.
life?
Yeah. I think the kind of, we were talking just before this conversation, the lived experience, the kind of the daily things that can come up. It's that sort of thing when it's like the information, and then you're like, how do you link the information to what's actually going on? How do I kind of tune into this and stuff as well? So yeah, we can delve into whatever you feel like, Ashleigh.
Perfect. Great. Yes. So there's a couple of different ways. I'll maybe chat about 3 different ways that sensory processing differences or difficulties can present in daily life. So the first way is, for those that might be wanting to do further reading, the word that you'd come across in the literature is modulation differences. And what that means is essentially how intensely our nervous system receives sensory information. So does our nervous system receive that as that sensory stimulus is too much, overwhelming, overpowering, painful, too much? Or does our nervous system receive it as too little, maybe doesn't really even notice it or feel it, or it's so dull or muted that it's actually quite difficult to respond to? So that's the first way, where some sensations can be really overwhelming and some sensations can be maybe a bit underwhelming. And John, if you don't mind me sharing some of the things that we've chatted about, I think that that was definitely one of the key areas of challenge for you in your daily life.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I just talk about a recent episode, and this is not just like as a musician. This is in the middle of a supermarket, and where I'm also a parent, so I'm not just looking after myself, where I can go and get my coping mechanisms and sort myself out, and then take myself out of the building. I've got two young children who may have run off to a different department. I'm in the middle of a particular aisle that, if you're staring there and you're kind of trying to, it's like figure out what you need for dinner for tonight. And then that decision making. And then before you know it, you're like, okay, well, then I've got this money here. And then you kind of ties it off to lots of different thoughts. So your thoughts are now scattered into multiple ways. And that then is then heightening my hearing. So I'm starting to hear I feel a hear in stereo. So
Mm.
all the sounds around me, so if there's four different sounds, they would sound 25%, each. So it's all equal. But in a supermarket, you've not just got four, you've probably got 20 to 30. So that starts to elevate. Then your temperature, I found, starts to elevate. Then my smell, I'm in the middle of a meat department or something like that. I'm like, oh, wow, this is really impacting. So yeah, you're right. There's situations like that I've kind of thrown into, and you've got so many different variable things. Now, obviously, there's resilience. We've had there for forever. We can cope with certain situations, but maybe that was masking before. Now, if I'm masked, everything has come to the surface a little bit more, much more sensitive. And this is where I'm like, the awareness and obviously knowing about the conditions, I was able to kind of, I phone my wife, but then I was able to sort of maintain and kind of, get back to a normalish level. But once I got the kids, I was like, right, we can't do any more shopping than what we got. We've got to get out of the building. But yeah, it's those kind of moments. I'm like, it doesn't just come up in unique moments. It's everyday life, things like that. So.
Mm. So that's interesting. So you were experiencing overwhelm in your auditory sound system, you were experiencing overwhelm in your olfactory smell system. And this is the thing that's quite interesting about modulation is that so when you are feeling quite regulated, that's a term that you and I have used through our chats, when you're feeling quite calm, safe, focused, regulated, we've got a different capacity in terms of our sensory experience. So you might be able to tolerate more from your sound auditory system. You might be able to tolerate a bit more from your smell olfactory system. But then putting you in an environment which is really quite sensory triggering, because I mean, a supermarket is probably one of the most chaotic sensory environments. There's lights, there's sounds, there's smells, there's people, there's movement, there's big, large open spaces, there's echoing, there's busyness, there's unexpected touch from people bumping past you. It's sensorially overwhelming.
Mm.
And you're having to keep to this to-do list and remember these things. So now you're quite in a distressed, dysregulated state. And then those sensory sensitivities are just heightened to the point where it can really kind of make or break that moment for you, whether you can cope and keep yourself and your kids safe, or it might actually, teach or push you into sensory overwhelm, collapse, where a stress response is triggered. And that can look different for different people. Some people might run away, flight. Some people might freeze. Some people might collapse on a ball on the floor. Some people might just appease and yes sir, no sir, whatever you need to do, right? To kind of just get out of that situation.
Mm. Yeah. And that overwhelming state, I mean, it was freeze for me. And you're right, like if there's also other compounding things that are going on, and you've got too many things, like I said, like the kids running off, you then quickly go, I can't be in this state because I'm supposed to be the carer, I'm supposed to be the father in this situation, and that makes it even more sort of complex. That actually can make it worse because you then got shame and guilt and all the other stuff sort of piling on top. So what we've talked about color zones and stuff in the past, and blue and different red. but I suppose almost it feels like an even complex blue, where you're just like, there is just, it's just going through multiple layers of that, and because it's gone from yellow to blue, or however it is, in very, very quickly. And like you said, navigating that, and trying to sort of move out of that, it can also be unexpected. So you might sort of
Mm.
think, if you were proactive and you're like, right, I'm going into the supermarket now, this is what's happened, this is what could flare up. But when sometimes I've got two extra beans or whatever it is going on and things as well, you're kind of, right, we'll just go in here, get the few bits and things as well. It can just pop up when you least expect it, like on a bus or on a train or on a station. Or these things also happen for musicians. You're going to a gig and you've got to pop on, like we do in traveling. And obviously, if I don't have my noise cancelling headphones on me, I'm like, uh-oh, I've already on the
Mm.
back foot, and I don't have those other coping mechanisms. So yeah, the severity of it, even if you're resilient and you've had it multiple times, I don't think it's one of those that the more times you have it, it gets easier. That's not what that is either. It's just how to regulate as quickly as possible from it. But yeah, I've gone off into different things there, but so that is the first one with.
Yeah, that's the first one, but that's totally relevant, John, because just to perhaps close off what you said there, when we're thinking about our sensory profile, and we were talking about modulation, specifically the intensity with which we experience some of our senses, that can be different with each sense. So you could think that some sensory information through your touch system might be underwhelming, and then some information through your auditory system might be overwhelming. So you can see a little bit of a spiky, differing profile that can also change day to day. Like we were talking about that stressful environment, which reduced your ability or your capacity to cope. But I'm just curious, in that moment, you had to draw on some tools. We've chatted loads about tools that help us to get back to a calm and regulated state. And, sometimes we can use sensory tools, which brings us back to the sensory experience of where we are right now. But sometimes those sensory tools don't work because, like in a shopping mall environment, well, it's the sensory experience of the environment that's overwhelming. So these tools that work for you today also don't work for you tomorrow. So I'm curious, what saved you in that moment? What helped you regain composure and get
So
out?
really interestingly, being in the middle of it's like a meat and fish aisle, the temperature goes down. So
Mm.
I was just like, right, take my coat off, because if I'm cold in this area, it's going to allow obviously my warmth to, I can at least get one sense down. And then I think also phoning my wife, I was just kind of like, there's a, or a text going, I think I'm just about to have an anxiety attack or something like that. And then she phoned, yeah, everything okay? And so it's like, no, I'm not having one, but I'm like, I think it's that as well. It's like, okay, before it actually happens, what are sort of prevention things that I can do? Right, phone the person, sort of contact, just to kind of get some, reassuring words. There's other things that I have been playing with, humming, because I know humming is a really great way to regulate the body, and obviously being a singer. And again, it's difficult if you can't hear yourself. You think you're humming, so you're trying to do those things. But it's just interesting when I just froze and I couldn't look left or right or anything as well. It's just like, okay. And you go into this sort of transfixed, hypnotized sort of phase, which is freeze. And I think what I clocked, we'd had gone through a walk, I think, around the park just before we went into the supermarket. So my body temperature could have risen before I went into the supermarket. So the kind of what you were talking about, there's things that obviously we don't know if sensory going to be triggered, but before I get into a train station, has one of my senses sort of been triggered by other things, temperature? Am I entering into that train station already in a warm state because I've run to the train station, and then obviously the other senses sort of start to spark off? But this is obviously after this situation happened. I was like, okay, what happened there? Da, 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 which is obviously analytical. But during that point, I was like, right, get to the freezer aisle or get to the the cold aisle or something like that, and just literally try and calm one of the senses down, and then I can then focus on the others. I think that's maybe a good sort of, well, for me it was, I can't do them all at once. So try and see if I can alleviate one of them maybe.
Mm.
And then I can then walk outside, take the noise off, do all that other stuff. So it's different for every single situation and environment, I believe. So
It is, but that awareness helps, right? And we've chatted about how temperature can be a real trigger for you. So when it is overwhelming, I mean, that's great that you used a sensory tool to go and cool your body down. I remember we also chatted about how car environments can be
mm,
quite overwhelming for you too, particularly when you're driving, because you're having to really focus and attend to what's going on the road, which there's a lot of unpredictable stuff that happens. People, pedestrians walking across the road, animals jumping out. Um, and how when you feel overwhelmed in that environment too, how reducing one sense in terms of what's feeling overwhelmed, whether that be noise or everybody just keep quiet for 5 minutes, just quiet. Let's
it's
just
kind of
calm that down.
yeah, it's, I feel like there's once again, maybe the profile, maybe you've gone through and figure out those tools, but it's like a handbag where you go, right, I've got all my tools in it, and I'm like, there's an SOS bag of, whether it's a backpack or a little box or something like that. And again, I have a little side sort of thing next to my door, and I try, before I even get in, I go, right, chewing gum, so I can chew. That just feels like it regulates me. That's one thing. I have my buds in there. I make sure I've got that, or in my pocket. So even if I'm not listening to music, I just put one in my left ear, so it cuts out a little bit of this noise here. And then the humming thing, and obviously trying to drink water and put the window down, and stop if I need to. But it's that very proactive thing before you get in the car. More often than not, actually, I get in the car, and before we even leave, I go back out. It's like having going, right, toilet break, got to do this, got to do this. And in that process, it's almost like muscle memory now. I'm like, right, toilet break, so you're not, focus on anything like that. And then water, and then this and this. And it's taken a while to kind of get those things. And nothing's ever perfect. I mean, that's, I think you've got to also accept. It's just like, you can have an SOS bag, or whatever it is, but you might just throw it onto the seat. And whilst you're driving, you're like, I can't reach over and get my stuff and do that. And unless obviously I've got other people in the car. With kids are kids sometimes, and they could be entertained for a while. They also have headphones and other sensory things themselves, partner, or passenger, their awareness of what's going on. So it's like, look, I'm going to listen to a podcast that's going to allow me on this long journey. So we're going to go from this, we're only going to drive an hour and a half, because you're right, all the sort of hazard awareness as well adds into it. You then add in a dark night, raining, that even adds even more sensory. So it's just, yeah, it's kind of prevention as best as possible. If I do feel tired immediately, because I know it's not just the drive, it's not just my energy levels throughout the day, which obviously would have been impacted and compounding. It's one of those where I'm like, okay, my sensories are overloaded now, and are making me even more tired. And I'm not scared to now go, right, can you take over now, please? We're going to go to the nearest service station or things. And I think it's just that communication with people and other people around you. We kind of go, before we get in the car, right, this is going to be a long one. This is what could happen here. If daddy sparks up or whatever it happens, it's not to do with you, it's to do with him, but let's try and help each other. So, but those things, you got to have awareness first, and then you got to try and figure out what's going on in your life and things, the education of it, the action where you get the tools, implementing the tools, getting the things. These things are not overnight, they kind of gradually take time. But like you said, yeah, the car situation was a huge one for me. It still is, but it's
Mm.
not as much as it was. So
Yeah, I really, really love that. And that's essentially what we would do to help people that are struggling in their daily routines or in daily life. So these Modulation difficulties can look like certain environments being overwhelming, certain daily routines being overwhelming, washing hair, clipping nails, bathing, dressing, um, catching the bus, walking through the school door, into the classroom, maintaining focus in class. Uh, all of these things can show themselves in daily life. And I think it's exactly as you said. It's the first point is around the awareness. How is my body a little bit different? How do I process this information differently? What does that look like for me? Then thinking about that proactive lens and that proactive approach, that preventative approach. Prevention is way better than cure, right? So, okay, so this is how my body works a little bit differently. So I find noise overwhelming in the car environment. Great. So what can I proactively do to help to prepare me for those situations, right? So, okay, I've got my headphones with my playlists. I've got my loop earplugs in case I need to completely eradicate any kind of background noise from that environment. So you've got your proactive strategies, and then it's practice implementing them, hit and miss. And then you've also got the more reactive, right? When stuff isn't going according to plan and things are starting to fall apart a little bit, what am I going to do? Who am I going to call for help? How am I going to stop? How am I going to take some time to just reset and pause? And that's essentially what that pathway of support would look like for someone who's struggling in this particular area.
So if we have obviously modulation, did you say there were three?
Yes. Yeah.
What's the second one?
And just to touch on one other thing before we move on, I think another important thing, and when we look at all of these areas of difficulty or challenge, really is the environment and looking about what tweaks and changes we can make to the environment. I really try to drum home the message with people that it's challenging environments, not challenging people. And we can't all cope with or thrive in the same environments. So we do need to be adaptable in terms of how we change our environments to help people to thrive and cope. So the second way that those challenges can present themselves in daily life is, if you're looking through the literature, the word that's used is discrimination differences or difficulties. And basically what that means is one's ability to describe the detail of certain sensory experiences. So the central nervous system has received or is starting to make sense of that sensory information. And now we need to be able to explain, describe, add detail to those sensory experiences. So you're touching something, but what specifically does it feel like? Is it hot? Is it warm? Is it freezing cold? Is it cold? Is it smooth? Is it rough? Is it corrugated? Is it, those adding the detail to sensory experiences. So for some people with these challenges, it might be difficulty. There might be a risk where someone might touch something and have difficulty knowing what that feels like in terms of that could easily burn themselves, right? So that's essentially it, is being able to add the detail to sensory experiences.
Okay. And obviously you sort of said a scenario there of is that also you can get assessed with it and things, but again, is that an awareness thing that over time, I think I probably may have alluded it to then when I was in the car and stuff as well. There's certain things, or actually more the supermarket. It's just kind of like, okay, I know the temperature, but is it even more detail to what you feel is going on in that? Obviously that was a sensory overloaded situation where I could analyze and things as well. I'm not necessarily analyzing when I'm regulated or anything as well, which maybe is probably a good awareness. That's probably a good awareness for me to go into, because the only time I'm analyzing these things sensory is when something's gone wrong, rather than actually when it's going right, which we can tend to do. But is that then just curious awareness of all those different phases that we go through? Or
so they all link and build on top of each other, but perhaps if we were to break it down into each sense, or maybe some more common sensory experiences to help explain it a little bit more simply. So let's pick the auditory sense, because that's quite a common one that people may struggle with in terms of some people find some sound experiences really overwhelming. Some people found some sound experience, they might be hard of hearing and maybe might struggle to hear what's going on around them. So if we're thinking about the first way, modulation, so, okay, I receive sound as too much, overwhelming, or, oh, I didn't really hear that, I struggled to hear that. Then the discrimination piece would be, okay, where did that sound come from? Which direction did it come from? Okay, it came from behind me. And what did that sound like specifically? Was it a loud hooting horn? Was it a sharp pinging noise? Was it a loud, low hum? What did that specifically sound like?
So is it more descriptive, basically?
More descriptive, exactly. So, but if you struggle with modulation, right? And so if that certain sound, perhaps let's say I played a sound, there was a car hooting, and you receive that sound as really overwhelming, intense, your central nervous system is triggered into a state of stress hearing that sound. The way that you might describe what that sound sounded like to you could be very different to perhaps someone who was hard of hearing and struggled to hear that sound at all. So if we have modulation differences, that also then means that we might have differences in terms of how we might describe the detail of what that sensory experience was like.
Okay. Great. Cool. So, and then what, then number 3, what's
third one is kind of putting it all together. And that's perhaps more the motor planning and motor coordination parts of life. So the practical doing bits, that also incorporates being able to mentally plan what it is that you want to do. So if you're wanting to hang up the laundry, you've got to be able to mentally plan those movements in your head first, and then you execute them with your body, and you pick up the laundry and you hang up the clothes horse, and you hang up the laundry over the clothes horse. So it's an integration and a using of all the senses to be able to do what you need to do in your daily life. So it's the motor execution, motor control, motor coordination component.
And so if you had something like a sensory overload, how would that particular sequence tie in? Would you have like, okay, what's the next phase? What's the next plan to be able to move that? Is that, or does that not tie in?
Yeah. So some people can have differences or challenges with all 3 different types when we're talking about the different ways that they can present. Or some people, their challenges might be more isolated, or perhaps more focused to one area of challenge. So we do look for different patterns in terms of how that shows itself in people's daily life. But the motor coordination piece, maybe a word that you've heard being thrown around or being used is dyspraxia. And that's the motor coordination piece, where people might struggle to plan, execute motor movements. And there's a lot of that you need in your daily life, really, that then feeds into a lot of our daily skills, and thinking about planning, organizing, keeping your space tidy, keeping your things in line, having what you need at hand. That can be really quite challenging.
And I imagine different things that you're trying to do, that obviously it can be even more severe if you've, with motor skills like that, if you're having to put the washing on the line, sometimes obviously it can just be automatic, but if you're having to think, right, I have to walk up the stairs, and then from walking up the stairs I have to bring up this laundry or whatever it is, and then I have to then fold them up in this way and do this, that is so many steps. If you're having to think about every single thing in your routine there, which I know for myself, I don't, it's very automatic. So that's very interesting as well, because if you've got, especially dyspraxia, and then you've got other sensory things going on that are not just touch and having to movement and things, that then is a multi-layered thing that's, I can imagine, is going on, and where you've almost got to have proactive processes and thinking before you even go into doing something like laundry. So that, where can that, if someone, if things are like that are maybe automatic, I'm just kind of trying to think of like other areas. But I suppose it depends on everybody has their different severities, maybe in different, especially, you know, speaking to neurodivergence necessarily, you know, where some of them are very heightened. I know, like you were talking about there, like sensor, the hearing. You know, I remember being in bands, and you know, especially in rehearsal rooms, or you're in the back of vans, or like trying to go to gigs and stuff as well, and it just gets incredibly noisy in that sort of environment, and you haven't even done the show yet, and then going into the green room, and then going in around the corner to the shop to pick up this and stuff, and you just do these things, you're just resilient, and you kind of, you know, but then there's the impact you can have about doing those things without the awareness. Just no wonder I was so incredibly tired by the end of it. And now sort of trying, and obviously that can dent the mental health, all sorts of things at the same time. um it, Again, at the moment it feels like I'm verbally sort of processing and expressing it, because it's just like, oh wow, this really ties into so many different areas that maybe I took for granted before, because you were just kind of like, well, I'm unaware, I'm just living this life, unhealthy coping mechanism, just going into it. Da, 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 da. But there's no wonder where, if you're kind of not looking at these things proactively, putting these awareness and processes in, then this can compound over time, which is
Totally.
what
That's
happened to
like
me.
that Coke bottle effect, right?
Right,
Where,
right.
I mean, even that example that you used about getting ready for a show and being in the band room and it's like really, really noisy, and all those years that you just coped. I'm sure you developed some coping mechanisms. I don't know what made it. Maybe it was to put your headphones on and sit in the corner, or maybe it was to have a couple of drinks to help
Yeah,
to
yeah.
essentially dampen that sensory experience, right? And then you bottle it up and you cope in that environment because you know that it's only for so long. But then there's ultimately that there's that crash, or there's that explosion after the fact, where it either might be that evening or the following day or a week later, where, and that's different for different people, right? But I mean, that can be full on pajama days where you
You just
just
can't move
cannot,
your bed.
can't move. You are literally just like lead, right? Just
And what it's
immobilized.
burnout, the amount of burnout you can go through if you're just constantly, you know, some people, I mean, all the time you just, I'll just get on with it, just get on with it, just plow through, just push through. And you can only do that so many times, like, and also I've now gone, what, I was working 70 hours a week on a self, and on my self-employed business for very little, and I was like, there's no wonder. I mean, that's just working, but you're using so many different sensories from it, and things, because you're in front of a screen, you're doing this. And now it's like I've had to cut it down by like 20 hours to go, no, because you have to take these things in pockets, and do it slowly, more pragmatic and things. And like you said there, with like certain gigs, I would do the gigs, but in the during the day I'd be doing a heap loads of other stuff. And no wonder it's just like builds up like the Coke can effect.
Mm.
And that's sort of resilience. Yes, it's, you know, important, we can have that determination, we can have that doggedness, but if you're doing it at the expense of that Coke can keeping, you know, popping open all the time, and like you said, suppressing those senses with unhealthy coping mechanisms, which I've now taken out of my life. So I'm like, well, if I don't have them anymore, I've now got to find healthy ways of doing this in a raw state. And yeah, that just means then obviously it's self-care. It really is self-care and self-love, and all of those other things. But yeah, again, I think you can kind of work on it and stuff as well. But also, when things do happen, or I have to have a veg day, I call it, I've lived to have to sit on the sofa, then I'm not beating myself up about it. I think that's
Mm.
another thing as well. It's like, no, okay, if I had a sensory overload and it might have embarrassed someone, or I don't know, whatever it is, it's not to do with that. It's like, no, you know, let's have some self-compassion, other compassion around it, because these things can come out of the blue. And like you said, like the car, you know, I remember so many times flaring up in the car, but there was not really any understanding of what I didn't understand. So everyone else didn't understand. They just saw obviously what was
Mm.
going on the outside. I think that's another thing as well. When you can see someone having something sensory going on and you can only see what's going on the outside, and even asking questions, are you all right? Everything? Can I get you something? I'm like, I can't talk. I can't, it's almost like I needed someone to come in and go, right, here's a glass of water. They know what to kind of give in that situation without asking, because sometimes the questions are even more sensory overload if I can't answer them and stuff. So,
Exactly.
and it's things like that where there's understanding, there's compassion, there's other, and the support you can have around you. But obviously the supermarket the other day didn't, so I had to have my own internal sort of support. But that's what can crop up on a day-to-day basis, I believe, with it and stuff. So
Oh, you said so many beautiful things there. And this is what I love about this awareness, really. It's awareness around if you understand how it is that your body ticks and how it is that you work, and then your network of support, whether that be your family, your colleagues, your parents, your people that you hold near and dear to your heart, who know you and support you and who are your cheerleaders, if they also have an awareness and understanding, is exactly as you said, what things look like on the outside and what your internal experience are often quite polar opposite or different. And when people have that awareness, then they can view that through a more compassionate lens. And then we can think about how we can prepare ourselves to make sure that our cup doesn't overflow. So how can we have our proactive tools available for us when we are going into those environments, or how can we mentally prepare ourselves for, you use the gig example, right? So rather than spending the entire day in hyper focus and working so that you're going into a gig environment, then your energy stores are depleted. How can you rather instead do something in preparation for that environment that's going to fill your cup and make you feel regulated and calm and resilient? And then you've got your tools for that environment. But also, as you said, sometimes we're not going to get it all right. And we are going to need to just have those crash moments or those days where we are not capable of doing much. But then also, because you've got that awareness, you're able to view that more compassionately too.
And I think that's obviously that's all human beings. We all need. I know, especially in the UK, having a nap in the day, it was just like, everyone never, it's like, how dare you, have a nap, siestas in other countries, but we
Ah,
don't do it. We're too resilient. We keep calm and carry on. That's the sort of slogan of Royal Family and all the other things. But it's kind of, when is enough when does it get to that point where, I remember just staying up late all the time and again binge watching stuff as well, and this escapism from going to bed because I knew the next day would like start again. And you just kind of like, right, okay, this really can start to compound. And like you just said, like actually having, a work day, but I've also, it's not just a work day, it's a work evening as well. I'm like, when does that stop? And it's really having to kind of go, take a step back. One of the most important things I think that really helped me with this process, and this is different for everybody, was unmasking.
mm,
I was masking for so many years, which probably why I drank and why I was in those music situations. You're like, right, I'll just put a different character on. And we can do this in professional networking sessions or whatever it is. But to do it all the time where you have the mask and then you go away and you're on the bus with the mask, you're in the home with the mask, and you're hiding parts of yourself, which is, I don't know, the good and bad. Maybe they're just all the same, but that is another element of exhaustion of sensory where you're suppressing parts of yourself, which I found were emotional at first, and then they became physical. I was keeping parts of myself physically until I've unmasked. And I kind of had this analogy recently. It's like Voldemort from Goblet of Fire and Harry Potter, where he was his rawest self, but he was this sort of, wrinkled self. And I felt when I unmasked for the first time, there was this 20-year-old John, who was in the bath, wrinkled, and I was like, I haven't been good to you. And again, this is very visual, but there's a sense of that as well. It's just like, once I've taken the mask off, now I've been able to look at the senses even more because I haven't got a harder shell. I've been able to kind of do the introspection. I've been able to kind of deep dive a bit more, and that's not overnight either. And you have to obviously be open and curious and willing to kind of to do that. But that has been such a powerful exploration, because even with the sensory stuff, I could have gone, oh yeah, surface, yeah, the information goes in, but it doesn't seep from brain down to the rest of the body. But I think the unmasking has been one of my most valuable things, and especially for a lot of ADHDers or even neurodivergent in general, when you're trying to mask yourself to just fit in, so you're not a square peg in a round hole sort of thing. Problem is, those things pop out over time. That's the only thing people see. What we were talking about, like someone can have a sensory overloaded experience, and you're like, oh, why you just come on, pull yourself together, da da da, all those kind of comments. It's just like, no, this is why, and I don't want to have to mask up again and go, oh yeah, okay, I'll just carry on. But there's finding a line of, we can't unmask obviously all the time. It's just like walking around naked. It's like, but it's one of those where do you feel comfortable with it? And I think since the confidence has grown, since unmasking, got my intuition back, got my authenticity and my voice back and confidence, it's starting to just get a little bit bigger. But I don't know, also, since I've unmasked, my senses have gone up even more because I'm not suppressing them.
Mm-hmm.
But all of this is just complete awareness.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is. And I know, speaking to a lot of people, they're like, wow, you really dived into it. I'm like, well, I'm a creative sort of explorer myself. So that's why I've been able to go into it. But, this is why I almost want to talk about the sensory side, because there's masking also with sensory, and there's unmasking with sensory that I've found. And I don't know, have you ever come across people who talk about the masking side of it as well?
Very much so, very much so. Particularly, perhaps less so with some of the younger children that I work with, naturally, because there's just far more awareness and acceptance, these days. But particularly with the young adult and adult population, that's a massive, massive thing, where a lot of us are brought up in home environments and school environments where it's very much just one size fits all, and everybody's got to get in line, and there's no scope or room for individuality, uniqueness, creativity. Well, I mean, that might be quite harsh to say, but there are definitely some environments where that's not encouraged. And masking is taught and encouraged. And it's a huge, huge topic and a massive difficulty, and also rightly so. Rightly so. This is what I love about this stuff and this work, is that our sensory experience is, as I said earlier, our primary experience of the world. And I think that when you understand what that looks like for you, you are one step closer to being your true, authentic self. And why not? That's what the world needs.
And I think, and it's interesting, going teetotal in February. And I'm not, what I'm not doing, I know there's a link between ADHD and alcohol and all these other things and stuff. What I'm not doing is going, no, don't, if you do this, don't do this. I'm like, everyone has, control and whatever they do. But it's one of those, my awareness of is like, oh, if I'm suppressing, what is that actually doing for me? Is it just kind of giving me a temporary kind of thing? If I know that and I want just a temporary, right, do you know what? I just want to have 1 hour of just suppressing, that's not what we drink alcohol. It's most of the time. We don't do it to deliberately suppress our emotions. We do it for, as a social engagement and stuff. But it's just been things that I've realized, what is my rawest self? That's where my exploration has gone. And it's interesting, but it's also quite scary, because you're just like, right, I'm completely cold. I've had to strip out coffee recently because I'm on titration, so that's for 12 weeks. And once didn't have it for like a week and a half. And then again, that can affect sensory, different things, obviously, external things like alcohol, like coffee, like these, sugar is a big thing in
Oh,
in
yeah.
our house, right?
Lack of sleep,
Lack of sleep, and
conflict, right, with our partners, at work. Yes. Yeah. Many, many things. Hey.
so, and I suppose that then is when you've got awareness, you're having internal awareness, but you're also trying to do external awareness at the same time, and like trying to find the balance between that, trying to work with it. And also you don't, other people around you, like, you're not changing people, you can't change people, but they might not want to adapt, they might not want to do this, especially if they're children and stuff, and they're work, figuring it out. And it's trying to also navigate that, where one day it might be all right, the next day it might completely fall apart. And those kind of strategies in that, this why working with someone, if you're a family or individually, you can build tools and things as well, but it's the navigation sometimes when you're kind of trying to use those tools on a daily basis, when you are building a plan. I don't know if it's an action plan and things as well, but
Yeah.
yeah.
For some people it is. I think all of it, right? Right from the awareness to understanding the intricacies of how that might change day to day or in different environments or around different people. It's not stagnant. Exploring tools that work for you, why they work for you, why they don't work for you,
Mm,
what works today but doesn't work tomorrow. Um, and then putting that into practice and can also be the challenge, right? I mean, sometimes awareness is the easy part, but actually practicing, exploring, reflecting, tweaking, changing, having professional help and guidance can really help with more positive outcomes, I
yeah,
guess.
because there's things obviously that, not just people, there's, finances. I mean, that can spark so many different emotional dysregulation, which can throw all your senses across. And then you've gone from this mental state where you're like focusing on it, and then the emotional kicks it in and just completely derides the whole thing. And that's why, all right, I've not been productive and it's completely fallen off, but it won't get better without, working on it and things. So there's so much awareness around just sensory, but in so many different facets of life, that I know when I was untreated and unmanaged and it became like a tornado of it, and I've just felt, oh, things were on fire and left, right, and center, to now getting treated and managed. I've looked behind me, I'm like, oh my goodness me, it's not a trail of destruction. That's not what I'm saying, but there's just this, the reason why my finances are the way they are, or the reason why this is the way it is, my business and stuff, is because, again, awareness, education, not knowing really what was going on. And that's quite hard as well, because you're not on a level playing field where I'm like, my finances are zero or my business is zero, and relationships and things. You're almost working from a deficit, and you're having to try and grow and build these things at the same time, which a lot of people I've spoken to in the neurodivergent community, they've got serious amount of debt, they've got relationship issues, they've got this and this and this, because they've not been able to get managed and treated and maybe diagnosed and get these kind of tools. That's late diagnosis. Obviously, dealing with like children with it, like you said, now the modern times, they're kind of like, right, okay, it's more accepted, there's much more information, there's much more support. And for the next generations, it's just like, okay, I hope, especially even for my children, they don't get into that situations, but even if they do, we've got the education, awareness and tools to be able to go, okay, let's not make this into a mole, a molehill into a mountain sort of thing. So it's a massive subject, obviously, and this is why I can imagine it's such a wonderful exploration, just not even professionally but personally, to be able to kind of go into this, because it's never ending.
Oh, yes, yes. It's something super passionate about. I could talk for days and days and days.
Yeah.
And even when you were just talking about the tools and what to do and what helps fit, right? I mean, you've got your sensory tools, but your emotional regulation tools,
Mm.
and they're also interlinked and so intertwined. And oh, yeah, it's a meaty subject for sure. But also, having said that, in terms of just having a basic awareness and understanding, it isn't rocket science. And supporting people to feel calm and safe and comfortable in environments also isn't rocket science. So I don't want to discourage people, but just by having a quick Google or looking on trusted local websites, you can really really help by just understanding or having awareness around the fact that that's different for different people, how we process information through our senses.
Mm.
And there are some small tweaks that people can make to the way that you relate, interact, engage with people, to environments that can really help people to feel calm and safe. So it really isn't rocket science.
It does feel like the nutrition over treatment, kind of like even just a whole sort of society and things as well, where there's a lot of people who like there's information on how you can have nutrition and diet and go up for exercise and stuff as well, but it's almost like, well, I'd just rather just take the meds and just kind of get it fixed. And this is kind of maybe a similar thing. It's just like the kind of deeper conversation, but between the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. And that's why I'm very explorative. I'm like, okay, creative, go into this. But for others who maybe it will take a little bit longer, or they need maybe different advice and stuff, where's the best place to, like you said, is it Google is the best place to sort of start this kind of, I don't know, exploration with it? Or
It depends where our listeners are listening in from. I mean, we're based in the United
yeah,
Kingdom,
so it'd be
so
different countries, yeah.
um, the National Autistic Society has some really nice, easy to understand information around sensory differences. Finding your local occupational therapist can also help you to understand what that looks like specifically for you. And then there's all sorts of stuff on YouTube. If you just Google around sensory processing differences, there's all sorts of short clips and videos which might be useful.
Because if you turn up and you go blah, 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 like me, I'd be like blah, 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 it'd be like, oh my goodness me, this is a life story that's just come out completely here, because it's obviously everything's all intertwined. And it would be like, okay, it's almost like with the sensory, well, I don't know, would that be the starting block, or would there be just a pre thing before the sensory, I suppose, an understanding of the person?
I don't think there's any necessarily right or wrong way
No.
to approach it. I might be biased, but I do feel that it's a really helpful place to start because it is our experience of the world through our senses. And we do know that differences in sensory processing is highly prevalent in the neurodivergent community. I mean, some autistic people, they say 90% of autistic people have sensory processing differences. So I do feel like it's a good place to start, a helpful place to start.
Because I think, especially if obviously it's a neurodivergent musician community, I even know that there's a stat of 80% of musicians, and this is Musicians Union, Help Musicians UK, so 80% of them have mental health issues, and again, my exploration of this and stuff, and this is not sort of solidified, but again, it's just like, okay, what does this look like? How many of the 80%, like me, that those things were actually co-conditions of what was going on underneath? And then again, another exploration. But you're like, well, do I go down, what do I have ADHD? Do I go down through that whole process to be able to find out diagnosis? Do I go down autistic and stuff? And you're going through also things that are backdated in regards to waiting lists and stuff as well for years and years and years. And obviously there's a huge waiting lists and different things. I've also got dyslexia as well. And I'm like, okay, how many traits of all of these different things? So taking a back step before kind of going into these processes or waiting lists and diagnosis and stuff, kind of getting that sensory profile just allows to see the spikes in different areas and things, which I think can have an even better sort of a deeper understanding of knowing, oh, okay, actually, it might be a Venn diagram. There's a Venn diagram of neurodivergent conditions that might be heightened in one area, but it might be a trail across all of them. And it's interesting that's not really talked about enough. It's almost like a label, get treatment, this label and things. And yeah, anyway, that's the kind of exploration that I'm kind of what you said at the beginning, where even neurodivergent people turn up, diagnosed, self-diagnosed, undiagnosed, curious, maybe even completely unaware of it, but like if there's things happening or starting to, bubble and things, where is the first place that you go to? Is it, these areas? And this is what I'm trying to explore, because, even just for my children or for other people that start to ask me about things, I'm like, well, I don't want to go and say, you know, I can't say you've got ADHD. I can't say these things. But what I would suggest is go and get a sensory thing, or, go and get an overview of what this is first. So I think almost like the sensory thing feels like the neurodivergent overview as well, rather than sort of, pigeonholing you in different places. I
Yeah.
think that's really valuable, because you're not having to, go through these things, but you're also incredibly stressful for waiting and stuff. So, I mean, yeah.
And you can have some quick wins too, because the strategies or the recommendations are often, well, very, very practical in nature. So sometimes if you're early on in that process, you might need some quick wins to make you feel like you're moving in the right direction, or some environments are a little bit easier to tolerate, or some routines, or maybe just going a little bit smoother. So it's
And also
helps from that perspective.
it's like awareness validation. You're kind of getting, at least, like you said, the quick wins that you can go, okay, I'm not having to wait this time. Because as soon as we found out I had ADHD and autism, I went into a hyper focus of all the resources and things, which is amazing, but it's also incredibly exhausting, because you're having to mirror yourself. You're going through the grief of your whole life to be able to, fill in the gaps and all those other things. So there's nothing really practical that is kind of going, okay, actually, there is this tool or this process or this assessment that can tell you something about you right now. And at the end of the day, once you get the diagnoses and stuff, all it's leading to is more awareness, more understanding, more tools, more ways of doing it. Since, again, the labels are important, I think, for understanding and treatment, but actually just having kind of like that better understanding of who you are and what's going on internally rather than externally, is major, step in the right direction of it. And things, these are things that I've kind of recently figured out. I'm like, oh, actually, yeah, like, I hyper focus so much on one particular, like ADHD for so long.
Mm.
And then I got the autistic one. I was just like, oh, hang on a minute, these are starting to cross over. These things there's something bigger in
It's
the
not so
whole
linear,
world.
is it?
It's
It's
not so
not.
linear.
That's not our experience. Yeah, we're all little bits of this, little bits of that.
Yeah. And when it comes obviously to the end of when we did the profile and the sensory, because obviously, like you said, it takes 3 hours. We won't have to go through all of that. But
Mm.
just very quickly talking about the sensory profile, because you sent me a document, and you talked about, obviously there was it's like the quadrum. There was the 4 different areas: the sensory missing, sensory seeking, sensory sensitive noticing, and sensory avoiding. And I suppose we can end on this, actually, of, we can talk about mine, because that's an example there, which I've got up now. No one else can see, but yeah, just maybe sort of talking more about that. And then what we do, kind of what I tend to do with these podcasts, is leave it with a recommendation at the end. So obviously I'll add links in to the description of where people can come and get a sensory profile or sensory assessment and stuff. But just, yeah, kind of using me as a case study here. Your thoughts?
So we did a particular assessment where we used a tool that was developed by an occupational therapist in America, Winnie Dunn, the sensory profile. And when we did the assessment with you, we realized quite quickly that your challenges were more in the first area that we talked about when we were thinking about modulation. So your experience of sensation sometimes being too much or not enough, which then made it a bit challenging for you to perhaps describe the detail to some of your sensory experiences. So that highlighted that the modulation bit was a little bit where you were struggling. So we did a sensory profile, and Winnie Dunn explains it quite nicely, where she thinks about there's 4, when we, the behavior is what we see on the outside. And there's 4 different profiles or quadrants or ways that people might display those differences in the way that they're and the way that they're processing their sensory information. So some people might go in search of more sensory experiences because those sensory experiences aren't enough, so they seek and go in search of more. So they've got quite a bit of an active response to achieve a regulated state. Some people are sensory avoiding, so some sensations are overwhelming and too much, but then they'll actively avoid those sensory experiences. Some people might be sensory missing, where the sensory experiences are underwhelming, but they don't really do anything about it. And some people might have a sensory noticing or sensory sensitive profile, where sensory experiences are overwhelming, but they also don't really do much about it to achieve a regulated state. So someone might brush past them, and that might be touch sensitive or sore, but they're not going to really do anything about that. They're not going to tell that person off or move out of the way. So they might just notice things, but not do much about it. So we kind of explained that concept to you, and then we took each of your sensory systems and we plotted them against that profile. And interestingly, you had a bit of a mixed profile where, well, this is often the case, but for you were quite avoiding of through your vision sensory system, your auditory sensory system, your touch sensory system, and your movement vestibular sensory system. So that meant that those sensations were quite overwhelming for you, too much. So you would actively try to avoid those sensations or those environments. But then you were missing some sensory information. So you weren't getting enough sensory information through your proprioceptive sense, so where your muscles and your joints and where your body is in space. And you were not getting enough information through your internal interoceptive sense. So paying attention and listening to what is going on inside of your body. So I remember you saying that sometimes you would go all day and you wouldn't have eaten or drunk or gone to the toilet. You weren't really and particularly we see that in hyper-focus mode, right? Where we're not very good at paying attention to those internal sensations. So yeah, we plotted against that profile, and I think that was perhaps the beginning of your awareness journey in terms of thinking about conversations, experiences, relationships, environments, jobs, and seeing them through a sensory lens, and then comparing that with your awareness of how your body processes that information and the way that your body ticks, and then thinking, hopefully, I think seeing things through a completely new light in terms of how you would do that, manage those situations or those routines differently in future, and also looking at the past far more compassionately, and just being kind to yourself.
So we're looking at these things here, and if I wasn't aware I had any neurodivergent conditions, right, for instance, neurodiversity, and I was coming and going, these things, would there be things that you could see that would link to, or do you just see it as just doesn't matter about neurodiversity or neurotypical? You just obviously see it as a person, but maybe the severity of some of the things that come up in the profiling could link to neurodivergent or conditions and things as well. And obviously I know it's difficult then, kind of like going, you need to go and do these things or look at these assessments and things as well. But does that come up as well, or has that come up before where you've had sensory assessments and it's kind of like picking up on certain things where you're like, okay, this is your sensory profile, but maybe think about, looking into neurodivergent conditions and things as well? Again, this is kind of like a pondering whilst I look at this, as if I didn't know I was neurodivergent, and I'm looking at this going, okay, what would if old John now was all this? I mean, he might not have been able to do a sensory assessment where he was, but that is kind of where my curious brain looking at this is gone for someone at the moment who's coming into this community or this podcast, who is not neurodivergent, but they're looking into it going, oh, I'm curious about this. Will this help me in, get a bigger picture of that sort of side of it?
Yeah. So maybe there's a couple of thoughts there. I think, first of all, we're all different, and no two people are the same, and everybody's sensory profile is different, whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent. However, I also don't want to undermine some of the experiences of some of the clients that I've had. I mean, even the conversations that I've had with you, John, have been really eye-opening and enlightening, because, I might be able to relate to the fact that I find movement makes me nauseous. I really struggle to be on anything moving, car, boat, any mode of transport makes me sick to my stomach. But then I've also spoken to some lived experience clients where their sense of hearing, for instance, is they're able to hear electricity in the walls,
Right,
for instance,
right, yeah.
or are able to hear dogs bark blocks away. So yes, we're all different, but that intensity or severity is very different person to person. So that definitely does come up through the assessment process, the intensity with which you might experience that, but also the impact on your daily life. Because for some people, sensory processing differences might mean that, like I use the example of myself, that, okay, well, I get nauseous on airplane rides, so I just got to make sure that I take some medication beforehand, and then I'm okay. So, in terms of the impact to my daily life, not massive. But for some people, that might be that some environments, the noise, for instance, is so overwhelming that they have to avoid those environments entirely, which could make perhaps going to the doctor's office and getting your immunizations, or going to check up on going to a dentist to get your teeth checked because you find the touch experience is overwhelming. You might, never go. And well, that's detrimental in terms of your health, right? It's a huge impact to your mental health, well-being, quality of life, physical health. So yeah, the severity and how it reveals itself, plays out in people's daily lives can be quite different person to person, and can be quite really, all-consuming for some.
Okay. So I mean that again, it's one of those where, I mean, obviously we could be here for hours, because it's just like such a deep exploration. I think I've even delved into it like massively now, because it's like now I've got treated and diagnosed and stuff as well, which is still valid, and I'm sort of leading my life with my insides very much feeling, starting to feel it's like I'm an even keel, or like I've not got a deficit. That's probably where I felt like for years I had, what was going on? Why am I, not able to just do the basics and things as well? And again, that can be developmental stuff and things as well. But these things of sensory, knowing every single environment I go into, going to like social events, whatever it is and stuff as well, and just literally just willingly going along. Or like, again, I used to be for bands and I used to be the driver, so I never was able to drink. So it's just like, wow, actually how much it can really trigger, especially any neurodivergent traits that are going on, how much it can heighten them. And obviously being treated, being managed, getting these things in my house, maybe obviously when the kids are settled and everything as well, it's like, okay, that feels normal. You throw anything else out of sync, it's not just the traits, it's like, no, there's something sensory that has triggered it here. And that's why I think this is like such a vital cog in all of this. It's almost like there's the awareness education, but it's just like, no, sensory is almost another word in there that is like, you've got to kind of get not just assessed for these conditions and stuff. There's other things that you really should be looking into, the sensory side of it, because it plays such a massive part in our day-to-day life. We can't just be at home, unless that's your life, and then obviously you're remote worker and you order your food online. Like you said, if you've got to go to the doctors or dentists or anything as well, and we also know getting out and being in nature, nature's such a strange one, because I go out in the middle of the forest and I hear all these sounds around me, but they regulate my system. I go into middle town and then I've got the same amount of noise, but it's really interfering, and it's like, that dysregulates me. And that's such a like, comparison with that. Why obviously going out in the woods and healthy walks, and I look at the roots visually and they all represent my brain and all the other stuff, but that sensory side of it as well, of what are the environments that make us regulated, which we could clock. Maybe that's a good one to start with. What's the environments that, that's probably part of the sensory processing and profile, and the development you would have with someone, is finding out those environments first, and going into it. This is something that before I never used to like walks. I never used to like going out in nature, because I used to feel it was a bit of a ball ache or whatever it is. I just want to stay at home, until I realized what it did for my brain at the same time. So that's another exploration, but I think it's really important for other people. It's like, it's not always like doom and gloom in certain environments and stuff. There are really,
and a really important part of this work is to also to focus on what does make you feel like regulated, what environments do work, what are your strengths too, not just focusing on the differences, the difficulties, or the challenges.
brilliant, Ashleigh. Thank you so much. Every time we always talk, I always feel like it's just brilliant, because it kind of like feels a mirror to what's going on right now, and why I'm advocating, why I'm trying to support others as much as can. Because the more information we have, not in a informative, like it's got to be tangible, interactive, and fun as well, and very visual. So I think we've alluded to already, but what if, for anyone sort of venturing into this and stuff, I think you said obviously Google and going to occupational therapist, but yeah, just kind of explore a bit online, maybe even just checking, just be aware.
Yeah, there's loads of free tools. If you look at like online sensory checklists, if you're looking for something brief, quick, and easy to just give you a bit of a brief overview, you can then reach out to your local occupational therapist. Or there's also lots of occupational therapists that provide support online. So it doesn't even need to be a local occupational therapist that supports people with sensory assessments or sensory profiling, or understanding the way that their senses work. That would be another good step. To touch on a question that you asked earlier, depending on the detail of the sensory assessment, that can definitely be a next step. Certain things might be uncovered through the sensory processing assessment, and occupational therapists might recommend further investigations in certain areas if certain themes are coming up.
Right.
So that could be an important next step in terms of getting a diagnosis, if that's meaningful and important to you. That isn't for everybody. So I think that's it in a nutshell. There's lots of free stuff online, but if you're wanting something a little bit more individual or bespoke to you, I would definitely recommend reaching out to an occupational therapist that can guide you through that process. Brilliant. And help you with so this is the what next. I mean, I actually believe that your sensory profile is the reason that you are a fabulous musician. I mean, I've worked with a young man who had a really attuned or heightened sense of smell, and he went on to a really successful career as a lab technician, right? And a lab flavor technician. So his heightened sense of smell and taste
Brilliant.
was what ended up being his career.
What the beauty, I mean, we are developing something called, I feel it's like from surviving to thriving, like that it's kind of like a program or something, but it in a way of that thriving is the, if you get understanding and support, and you can build up those things that feel, again, they will struggle, and we will have to sort of manage them and things. But what if you flicked it to the other side? What's the possibility? What's the, I know these people use superpowers and stuff as well, and they can be powerful, but actually it's like you've just said there, being the musician I am, I don't think I'd be the musician if I didn't have this sort of sensory profile and things. And the same with the lab technician that you're talking about there. That's where you go into your strengths, and that's where you can build up your confidence and really build a career or life in that way. And that's a really important message, I think, as well, for helping people to steer them to that, so we don't always have to stay in this area. So I think that's a really great note to end it on. So thank you so much, Ashleigh.
Thank you so much, John. It was really, really great chatting to you as always. And I also just wanted to thank you for your openness and vulnerability, because I'm sure people listening to this podcast will take tidbits away and benefit from it. And I know that as a professional, I've also hugely benefited from the open, vulnerable conversations that we've had in terms of your lived experience of all of this. And I feel like it's made me a better professional. So thank you.
Oh,
You
thank
too.
you so much. Do you know what, that it means a lot, 'cause sometimes you're like, do you want to talk too much and say this and stuff? So actually no, it's right just to be open about all of this and see different angles of it, shine a light, and wherever it is that sometimes you can see things that you like. But again, I think that's the lived experience maybe as well. It's like, or whatever it is, everyone has a different lived experience, but being open about it, it's hard. But I think since doing this and obviously having conversations with yourself, it's just getting a little bit easier and easier. Sometimes it doesn't work in my favor. Sometimes I open my trap too much and stuff comes out. I'm like, you didn't need to say that, John. But that's the risk I'll take sometimes for actually just trying to get to the things that we talk about. But I think every time again we have a conversation, even more things come up and stuff as well. So I'm sure we will have even more. So thank you so
Yeah.
much, Ashleigh.
Thanks,
Brilliant.
John.
And I'll speak to you soon.
Speak to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Hey, thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to hear more episodes, head to your favorite podcast app or platform and search for the Neurodivergent Musician. There are lots of solo and guest episodes to dive in with insights, improvised babble, and recommendations. I also encourage you to go and check out my new album, Neurodivergent, which is how I process my whole experience from unaware to aware, from undiagnosed to diagnosed, and more through music. And finally, if you are a neurodivergent musician and looking for a community where you can unmask and be you, please do come and join in. We deliver free workshops with Q&As and more. All links are in the podcast description, or you can find out more info at johnhartmusic.com or the neurodivergentmusician.co.uk. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Cheers. Take care.